Actually arrived in Toronto in the early 70s, and it was exciting. There were job opportunities for women that had never existed before, and there was a whole cohort of baby boomers ready to take those jobs on. I think feminism was really starting to take hold. You know, it had started with women, with their collectives and whatever, but now it was going into the establishment, into places of work, into the government, and that started opening up opportunities for women. Women were not considered suitable for management. I started in broadcasting. Women were not allowed to read the news on air. Our voices were not considered authoritative enough. We didn't have the gravitas. People wouldn't believe what we said. And all of that was changing. People were starting to give women a chance, and we were seizing it. Well, as you can imagine, the power dynamics at home were changing. Women were starting to speak up. They weren't as submissive. That was great for a lot of relationships, but a lot of men did not like that. There was a lot of pushback. And that was seen, I think, most often at home. The point is that the media was not talking about this. This was still considered a personal matter, and as a result, for example, police tended not to interfere, but the media didn't report on it. It was something that was completely hidden. What we were seeing as women gained more and more power, whether it was at jobs or becoming politicians or whatever, was that a lot of men felt very threatened by this. This wasn't what they had expected. They were used to being top dog. There was a lot of noise about how men did not want to work for women bosses because that had never happened before. They did not want to be told what to do by women. And so what we saw was this pushback, which unfortunately sometimes became very violent. But overall, the male establishment did not want to see this, did not want to see the level of pushback and how much danger that put women in. I mean, it exists today, you know. During COVID, why was there an increase in domestic violence? Because men were being squeezed. They'd lost their jobs, or they were isolated, they couldn't do what they wanted to do, they were scared, whatever, and so they had to take it out on somebody. For some women, that would have been a nightmare. Well, I can remember that when Interval House opened up, the headlines were that they were sheltering runaway wives. The idea was that they were interfering in the marriage and that they had no right to be there, and the women did not have the right to leave an abusive situation. Well, you weren't hearing much about this. I was busy in my 20s and into my early 30s, forging my own career. I was lucky, but I became aware that there were many women who were not being given these opportunities. And in fact, if I thought of the women who were most disadvantaged in many ways, it was women who were suffering from violence in the home, and I wanted to help. As I recall, in the 80s, I became aware of Interval House, and I approached them to see if there was any way that I could help by volunteering. One of the things I recall that Interval House told me that I thought was so important was it was the only shelter at that time that was accepting women with their children. So for most women, if they wanted to leave an abusive relationship, they had to leave their kids behind. And women won't do that. Mums won't do that. So that trapped them. So the fact that Interval House would take the kids just gave an escape for so many desperate women. All small charities, like Interval House was at that time, have trouble raising money, but Interval House had a particular problem, and that was that they were dealing with an issue that nobody wanted to talk about. Interval House was starting to get some media awareness, but this was not a cause that any business was going to attach itself to. So Interval was pretty much on its own. One of the problems with grappling with domestic violence is it makes men look bad. And so men don't want to be associated with it. They don't want to admit that this is happening. So it really was difficult to get respect for this issue. You had to fight hard and long and be loud in order to get people to understand that this was something that people should be paying attention to. It was hard enough to get funding for an organization like Interval House, but to have widespread budget cuts that affected everybody made it nearly impossible. There was no place to go. You were standing in line with dozens, hundreds of other charities who were looking for money, and Interval House was not at the top of anybody's lists for charities that they wanted to support. I was on the fundraising committee, and we managed to get into Eaton Centre one spring and sell flowers for Mother's Day. We thought we were successful. We were, but we raised less than $5,000. You can't run a shelter, an organization, when that's the kind of money that you can raise. And it was very difficult to find anybody to sponsor Interval House at that time. You have to understand that Interval House developed as a group of very committed women working more or less as a collective against the establishment, against the male hierarchy. So the idea of going to corporations, to male-run corporations, to the establishment was kind of against everything that Interval House had stood for. But they also recognized that that's where the money was. And if they wanted to do what they wanted to do for women, they were going to have to maybe find some way to get corporate sponsorship. I remember going to their house in the annex, and they had maybe 25 women crammed into this house. There was no room for anything. There was no money for anything. There was a desperate need for more people. You can imagine there were hundreds of women who would have liked to have been there, but they had no room for them. So Interval House wanted to expand, to get more room, to be able to bring more women in with their children, and to provide more programs for them. All of that took money. It was really exciting to see the attitudes shift in society to the point where finally there was a recognition that this was happening, that this shouldn't happen, and that there should be resources to do something about it. Me Too is the one that we all know about, but even in the years before that, there was a growing understanding that this was a power dynamic, and if the husband or the partner or whoever had all the power, then these women were quite desperate and didn't know how to get out. And people understood that they needed some help, they needed support. And it was so heartening to see people, individuals, organizations, companies start to come and say, we'll help. Words matter. And what we saw over the years was the words describing how society looked at this. You know, they started out as runaway wives. Then there was an understanding that these were situations of violence, so they became battered women. And then finally, people understood that this really is domestic violence. These women are now referred to as survivors of intimate partner violence. So we're finally calling it for what it is. With things like the Me Too movement, we were making such strides. And then COVID hit. And suddenly we realized just how vulnerable so many women still were. Because suddenly you had a lot of men who were very frustrated for all sorts of reasons, stuck at home, and things turned ugly far more often than they should have. I'm an optimist by nature, and it's been wonderful to watch over the 40 years or so that I've been involved with Interval House just how far we've come. There is a legitimacy to this issue now. People don't try to sweep it under the rug. People don't try to deny that it happens. People genuinely want to help. People believe women. They listen to women. They believe women now. But we're still seeing unbelievable levels of domestic violence. I grew to feel so much admiration for these women who were standing up in what was still very much a male-dominated world and saying, you have to pay attention to this. You have to do something about this. I remember that they were in the media every chance they could get. They were just getting out that message when nobody wanted to hear it. That takes a lot of courage. Looking back, it's remarkable what Interval House has done, what the journey has been like, how courageous and persistent that group has been in making sure that they can help these women. But there is just so much more to do. We saw that in COVID. It was so disheartening to see the violence just surge up again. They've got a lot of work to do still. We all do.